This is part 7 of Dawson, a series on the evolution of a fictional New England mill city utilizing real history. Last episode, we talked about the continued immigration to Dawson, streetcar suburbs, and the credit union. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend doing so. If you already have or just like to listen out of order, then welcome to the show. Fair warning, this episode contains histories of white supremacy and violence. This may be uncomfortable to listen to. This is Dawson. Looking at old black and white photographs, it feels different than looking at color ones. Without the color, the photograph feels like it's suspended in some sort of fiction, something that's not from our world or experiences. But they are. Seeing black and white photos of the KKK in the 1920s feels unreal. I don't remember where I learned about it, whether it was high school or middle school, but the first time I learned about the KKK, I remember that it seemed almost cartoonish, especially the outfits. As I got older, I became gradually more exposed to a reality with that same xenophobic ideology. I began to notice that it was still a thing, but it still felt unreal, like a movie with actors in costumes. It wasn't until maybe my sophomore year of college that I learned just how crazy it all was. As someone of Franco-American descent, it completely shocked me to find out that my ancestors were targets of the KKK. Before, it was something that I didn't have a connection to, something unreal. But finding that out, the movie became a documentary. The 1920s marked a xenophobic era in American history. To understand why, we need to go back to the Reconstruction era in the United States. The original KKK existed for 6 years directly after the Civil War as a response to the Reconstruction in the southern United States. The main goal was to destroy the Republican Party, which at the time was a liberal abolitionist party. The Southern Poverty Law Center has a project called Klan Watch, with the intent to curb Klan and racist violence through litigation, education, and monitoring. They write, quote, "The bare facts about the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and its revival half a century later are baffling to most people today. Little more than a year after it was founded, the secret society thundered across a war-torn South, sabotaging Reconstruction governments and imposing a reign of terror and violence that lasted for 3 or 4 years. And then, as rapidly as it had spread, the Klan faded into the history books. After World War I, a new version of the Klan sputtered to life and, within a few years, brought many parts of the nation under its paralyzing grip of racism and bloodshed. Then, having grown to be a major force for the second time, the Klan again receded into the background. This time it never quite disappeared, but it never again commanded such widespread support." It continues. "The answers do not lie on the surface of American history. They are deeper than the events of the turbulent 1960s, the parades and cross-burnings and lynchings of the 1920s, beyond even the Reconstruction era and the Civil War. The story begins, really, on the frontier, where successive generations of Americans learned hard lessons about survival. Those lessons produced some of the qualities of life for which the nation is most admired: fierce individualism, enterprising, inventiveness, and the freedom to be whatever a person wants and to go wherever a new road leads. But the frontier spirit included other traits as well, and one was a stubborn insistence on the prerogative of frontier justice. An instant, private, very personal, and often violent method of settling differences without involving lawyers or courts. As the frontier was tamed and churches, schools, and courthouses replaced log trading posts, settlers substituted law and order for the older brand of private justice. But there was always those who did not accept the change. The quest for personal justice or revenge became a key motivation for many who later rode with the Ku Klux Klan, especially among those who were poor and uneducated. Today, it seems incredible that an organization so violent, so opposed to the American principles of justice and equality, could twice in the nation's history have held such power." End quote. The first KKK of the United States Reconstruction era started as a simple mischief, but later turned into bloody violence and gained government control to institutionalize and embed racism in their southern state governments. Just after the First World War, after decades of no activity, the KKK revived out of what appeared to be thin air. The revival of the KKK didn't happen without reason. The second revival began in 1915 and lasted until 1944, but declined heavily in the 1920s. In 1915, a highly controversial film called Birth of a Nation was released. It told the story of the Civil War era and the Reconstruction era right after it in the southern United States. This movie idolized the KKK, and as a result of this, many people across the United States became influenced by the film. The second Ku Klux Klan emerged. It catered to different regions, as an article called When Bigotry Paraded Through the Streets from the Atlantic describes, quote, "Ideologically, the Klan blended xenophobia, religious prejudice, and white supremacy together with a broadly conservative moralism. Amidst a global recession that came in the aftermath of World War I, fear and anxiety were widespread among native-born white Protestants that the country that they had known, had been accustomed to dominating, was coming undone. They worried about an influx of Eastern European immigrants who adhered to communism and other supposedly subversive political creeds, about the seemingly growing influence of Catholics and Jews in American life, and about the migration of African Americans out of the South. The intellectual vogue for religious modernism, the expansion of political and sexual freedoms for women, and the perception that immortality, crime, and vice were all on the rise only confirmed the sense that the world was spinning beyond their control. The Klan advocated the restoration of true Americanism and offered members a platform that demonized blacks, Catholics, Jews, Mexicans, Asians, and any other non-white ethnic immigrants, while also condemning communism, most other forms of leftist politics, and base cultural influences such as alcohol, birth control, and the teaching of evolution in public schools, presenting itself in part as a Christian moral reform organization and in part as a vehicle for entrenching the economic and political power of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The Klan flourished with the promise that energetic white nationalism and traditional morals would hold back the tides of modernity and ensure that forces scheming to undermine the authority of native-born white Americans would be kept at bay." End quote. The second KKK had a large presence in Maine as a result of the population of Franco-Americans, Irish, and other ethnicities. Maine Klan leader F. Eugene Farnsworth toured the state recruiting those who were susceptible to organized white nationalism. Some of the activities that the KKK in Maine was known for were frequent cross-burnings used to terrorize local immigrant communities, installing puppet politicians into positions of power, and once detonating a bomb in the Franco-American community in Lewiston. They were very politically active and successfully installed the governor in state office, Owen Brewster. By the end of 1924, the KKK had gone as quickly as it had come, ending years of terror. Internal conflicts, membership declines, and financial issues caused the main state chapter to die off. In addition, scandals within the national organization signaled the beginning of the end for the second revival. One of the pillars of the anti-immigrant and xenophobic movement has been discrimination against any non-English language in the United States. In 1919, the Maine state legislature passed a discriminatory language law aimed directly at francophones within the state of Maine, specifically to the Acadian population of the St. John River Valley in northern Maine. This bill banned the French language on school grounds. An example of punishment teachers would use against students was forcing them to repeatedly write, "I will not speak French in school," on the chalkboard. This was a statewide law, so it didn't only happen in northern Maine, but also in mill cities like Lewiston, Biddeford, Waterville, and Brunswick. Fortunately for many Franco-Americans in these mill cities, the parochial schools were not subject to this law because they were church-owned. Because of that, they drew in more Franco-American students from the public schools and prospered during this time. Some parishes, including the Annunciation of the Blessed Parish in Dawson, began free tuition and were able to fulfill their remaining operating costs due to endowment from the local Franco-American community. Parochial schools are K to 12th grade schools operated by the local Roman Catholic parish. Prior to the turn of the 20th century, many parochial schools in mill cities were in the churches themselves, but as both funding and attendance grew, parochial schools began to move into their own buildings. By the late 1930s, all churches in the Annunciation of the Blessed Parish had their own parochial school. In around 1940, due to the continued increase in attendance, a secondary parochial school would be constructed, consolidating all secondary education students in the parochial school district under a single roof, called St. Aquinas Roman Catholic Academy. A Catholic academy is just a secondary school privately run by the local Roman Catholic diocese, as opposed to the parochial schools which are run by the parish. For Dawson, however, this doesn't matter as much because it is the diocesan seat. By the time that even the first parochial schools were built, the Roman Catholic Church in Dawson was a significantly majority Francophone. The percentage of Catholic Church attendees who are Anglophone was in the single digits, meaning that there were very few Irish Catholic or other ethnic groups in the schools besides the Franco-Americans. Even so, the parochial schools and Catholic Academy were bilingual. Half of the day was in French and the other half in English. As Wall Street experienced soaring stocks in the later 1920s, industrial communities like Dawson began to see decline. As Franco-American historian David Vermette writes in his book, A Distinct Alien Race, quote, "In 1923, the number of spindles nationwide began to decline. 2 years later, the South had more spindles turning than the North. By 1965, spindles in southern mills outnumbered those of the North 24-1. End quote. Many of the larger mills and manufacturers in Dawson and other New England mill cities left for the southern United States, as it was closer to cotton plantations, and there was less unionized labor. In American popular culture, the 1920s is often thought of with prosperity and excess. But for the mills of New England, the opposite was true, and the Great Depression arrived early in these cities. The 1930s weren't unique for New England textile mills in comparison to the rest of the country. Nationwide, the Great Depression had a grip on the day-to-day life of many Americans, and horses were being replaced by cars. As private cars began replacing public transportation, the Dawson-Portland Interurban halts its service permanently. In 1938, we saw a scandal that rocked American cities, with its effects still prevalent to this day, the Great American Streetcar Scandal. National City Line was a public transit company that began purchasing local public transportation systems, and began to monopolize the bus industry and replace streetcar lines with bus systems. This was done with investment from General Motors, Standard Oil, Firestone Tires, Mack Trucks, and a few other companies who had special interest in the road transportation industry. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, we started to see streetcar lines replaced with buses in many cities, and within a few years, all streetcar lines were replaced with buses because of their cheap running costs. This was no different in Dawson. Ever since the first colonialization of North America, homes were built using wood. In Europe, from the 16th to the 17th century, new buildings were using materials like stone and clay. Before this, people in medieval England used straw and wood. This moment is known as the Great Rebuilding of England, as England was becoming deforested and the government pushed the use of stone and clay instead of wood. Stone was especially a choice material for wealthy families, as author and social critic James Howard Kunstler writes in his 1993 book, The Geography of Nowhere, quote, "A stone building was both a monument to the family name and a repository of its wealth." End quote. Stone construction was not exported to North America. The colonists were using the same materials that the medieval peasants of England were using, wood and straw. But they had no reason to import the stone building methods from England because they were surrounded by forests, especially in the northeast, what we know as the Adirondacks, New England, Quebec, and the Maritimes. They had even more reason to use lumber for construction because they were also trying to clear out acres of land for farming and pastures. So, what do you do with all the extra lumber? You build houses. In 19th century North America, stone gained popularity in construction, especially among public buildings. Wood, however, still remained the common building material for residential units. But it wasn't until the advent of the balloon frame that wood would truly become king, as author Kunstler describes, quote, "Prior to the balloon frame, all wooden houses were supported by post and beam frames. Massive timbers were connected by joints, such as the mortise and tenon, and secured with wooden pegs called trunnels. Post and beam framing required skilled joiners and a great deal of labor, so that building a house was a momentous undertaking. By the 1840s, this began to change. The vast virgin white pine forests of Upper Michigan were opened up to exploitation. The wood was milled to standard dimensions in enormous volumes. It could be shipped easily across the Great Lakes and the new network of eastern canals. Consequently, America's favorite building material became cheaper than ever. By this time, too, inexpensive factory-made steel wire nails had appeared on the scene, making it possible to connect pre-sawn lengths of wood without fancy joinery. Now, a house could be whacked together out of 2x4-inch studs, nailed at 16-inch intervals. A couple of framers could do what used to take dozens of carpenters under skilled supervision in the old post and beam days. Balloon frame structures proved to be surprisingly strong, at least over the short term of, say, a single lifetime. Beyond that, as any American who owns a 19th century wooden house knows, gravity and rot inevitably deform the structure. A far more enduring legacy of the balloon frame was that it transformed the craft of house building into an industry. In so doing, it turned houses into commodities, things made above all to be sold at a profit, so that those who ended up living in them were not the same ones who built them, meaning that they were houses built without affection, merely products whacked together for a mass market. End quote. As Kunstler describes, houses were no longer structures built for generational families, as we saw only a few decades ago with triple-deckers, which were balloon frame. And, while homeowners at this time now rarely live in a house for more than half a lifetime, these places did not need to last. It was found that the most profitable practice was to keep cranking out these temporary structures. Kunstler continues, quote, "By the 1920s, with the car on the scene, all the elements were in place for the mass selling of mass-produced houses to the masses of corporate toilers, except for easy financing, and that problem would be solved as a matter of federal policy between the Great Depression and the end of World War II." End quote. Companies like Sears and Roebuck sold cheap one-size-fits-all kit homes. The value of the home was minimized from the communal domain of the multi-generational extended family to a place where they just so happened to live. The 1940s changed quite a few things in these mill cities. During World War II, Some of the mills that closed during the 20s and 30s started back up briefly to make parachutes for the war effort, employing many who were out of work. However, this was temporary and not on a scale to make a big difference in the local economy. After the war, many veterans became married, had children, and as a result, a boom in cheap housing was needed. The next episode will see the biggest change to the urban landscape in America in centuries. Thanks for watching or listening to the 7th episode of Dawson. If you like this, please consider subscribing so you can be the first to know when episode 8 drops, and leave a like to show your positive reinforcement. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle unnamedwithmatt, and if you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com.